Howdy, y'all. Welcome back to Some Antics. It is a wonderful Tuesday. I'm so happy to be here with you. And I'm so happy to be here with Dave Rupert. Dave, how's it going?
Hey, how's it going? Thanks for having me. It's great to be here. So,
It's great to have you. I initially went to Twitter. I would love to just actually have your face up bigger first, though. I went to the wrong scene because I'm a professional streamer. But yeah,
I
it's great
you
to.
are a professional. We've been in the green room here for a few minutes, and
Mhm.
you have a full blown setup. I'm so impressed. I
Thank you.
would be in panic mode the whole time. So you're doing a great job.
The thing I've found about streaming is it's such an incremental thing. Like I've been at this for a year and only recently have I been like, oh, actually I should probably polish the like onboarding experience for guests.
Well, you don't figure that out till a few episodes in. That's why I
Yep.
say with podcasting is like you need to do 10. You need to do 10 bad ones, and
Yes.
then
Mhm.
you get an idea what to fix, and usually it's your audio. And then and then once you spend
Yes.
a few $100s on a microphone, then you fix the next thing. So I think you got to get 10
Yes.
in before you know what you're doing.
My first stream, and I just put a link to that in the chat. My guest was Anthony Campolo, who is wonderful, incredibly great person. And I cropped in his face way too much, to the point
So
where he
it
was
was like
missing a forehead. Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
yeah.
It's absolutely criminal the cropping I did to that man. And he
Yeah.
still came on 3 more times after that. Um, but
What a
yeah,
saint. What a saint.
your
Yeah.
first few bits of content creation are just gonna be absolute like garbage polish wise, and then you find your footing. Um,
And
yeah,
it's
so
nice that people in chat or whoever are like patient with it. And I think both of us could probably say thank you to anyone who was there in the early days because it's tough. It
yeah.
was rough. So
Totally. Hey, so you've alluded to this fact that you have a podcast. For anyone who is in the chat and somehow has missed your existence, would you care to give yourself a bit of an introduction?
yeah. Hi, I'm Dave Rupert. I am a web developer based in Austin, Texas. I work for a company called Paravel. We're a three-ish person shop, and we all are in Austin, but and we do client services for large companies, Microsoft, Papa John's, Wired, um, Retail Me Not, things like that. And but over the last actually like 6 months or so, I've kind of been shifting. My role has kind of shifted. Still a developer, but I'm like building out a product. We're building a product called Luro, and that's at luroapp.com. And it's basically like I don't know, like a meta dashboard sort of thing. But it's basically like if you've ever had that problem at work where you're like, hey, why are the buttons purple on the website? Uh, and everyone kind of stares at each other and goes, I don't know. I guess we'll have to email Sally, who has to email Tim, who has to email Jessica, has to email Carla to figure out that answer. We're trying to solve that problem or assist in solving that problem. So that's the Luro app, and we're excited to be building it, but it's not quite ready for everyone yet. We're just kind of doing like alpha customers right now. So excited to be doing that, but that's what I do. And then with my other time, not much time, I do Shop Talk Show with Chris Coyer from CSS Tricks. You might know him. And we have been doing this for the last 10 years. So 505 episodes now. And so going strong. It's fun. And we just recently started doing like YouTubes and stuff like that. So kind of fun to break into video content and all that. So.
Good deal. Well, welcome to the show. It is incredibly exciting to have you. And today we're going to be talking about Open UI. So I guess the first obvious question is, what on earth is Open UI?
Good question. So OpenUI, the way I like to describe it is like it's a collection of browser people, CSS spec authors, accessibility experts, design system practitioners, and then like normal podcast pundits like me. And we all kind of get together, meet weekly ish, and try to It's sort of like it's a lot of research. We kind of like look at the kind of grand scheme of design systems in general and UI patterns and everything, and we're trying to distill that information down into something that makes sense, and then something that can possibly inform future elements, future standards, improve existing standards, stuff like that. So we're kind of trying to distill the sort of all of UI, the art of UI, down into some specs. So that's sort of the goal of the whole thing.
That sounds like no easy feat.
It should take a couple of weeks,
Yeah,
and we'll
yeah,
be done. So
I've seen a button before. I'm pretty sure I could, I can make it work.
yeah, I mean, yeah, it's just a button. So why not? It should be that easy, right? So,
Of course.
uh, but yeah, so it's the history of it's kind of cool. I think it was Greg Whitworth, who was over at Edge at the time, was kind of like, Edge was figuring out what they were doing, kind of even uh, pre Chromium days. Yeah, here's a great post from Greg. Greg was, and so Edge had sent out surveys like, what are developers struggling with? What are they like customizing over and over? What do they keep doing poorly or whatever? And what repeated effort burdens can we solve? And on this, this chart right here, the top 10 form controls recreated by web developers. And the number one thing people recreate is a select. Like 10% of websites recreate select. And that's like, you don't want to do that, right? like
Mhm.
like there's a lot of accessibility, a lot of I guess extensibility. Like working on iOS, you get that little rotor, the slot machine UI and stuff like that.
Mhm.
There's a lot of things built into select that you don't really want to go building your own thing. So I think it's really cool that they kind of looked at all this stuff and sort of like identified these problems. And so I think from there, Greg and other people at Edge, Melanie Richards, and you know, Una Kravitz from Chrome. I'm trying to think of who else. And also at the same time, there's this web we want FYI thing from Aaron Gustafson and Stephanie Steinbeck. They're all kind of, it's sort of like a place to air your web gripes. Web we want.org. Yeah.
What's it?
Okay. Or no, web we want.fyi. Try.
Okay. Yeah.
Maybe that's,
Web.
it could have changed. I remember a green site. That's the only reason
That's it.
I
That's the one.
that's the
That's the
one. That's
one.
one. But it's basically just like I want this, and you just send it in, and the browsers get it. So pretty cool thing. But so they're consolidating all this information, like pulling it all in, and they really saw a need for new UI controls. But as it turns out, new UI controls are really hard to make. You don't just walk into a W3C meeting and just say, I invented new tabs. I invented tabs and we're shipping it today. You don't just walk in with that. You need a lot of research behind that. You need to kind of get developer sentiment. What are people doing with it? What are people not doing with it? What's in scope? What's out of scope? And so I think the open UI, the goal there was sort of to kind of distill that information, sort of like what I'm saying, to possibly bring out new elements. And yeah, here's a great example, the openui.org there.
Yep.
So this website is a great website, but this is kind of where all the research dumps into, and you can kind of go through all this stuff. If you go down, we're kind of like breaking apart, like looking at it across all these different design systems, like how are they approaching a date picker? What does it look like? What does it do? And some of this is already in Chrome. Like some of these learnings have already kind of matured in the new like Chrome customizable or like new Chrome standard controls. But this is just sort of like an example. look at all the parts, and then we kind of figure out what makes this up, what's good, what's bad, what's in scope, what's out of scope. And so if you go back, actually, there's a really good up at the top, the component name matrix. This is the perfect screen. This is the best best screen of the whole website. Um, this is basically going through every single design system, or like, I guess it's like 18 different design systems, and figuring out what things are called, right? Like, and if you sort by, click the sort by button, yeah, and that'll change it to popularity, basically, or
Okay.
frequency, match count. These are the most commonly used components across all design systems. So like 89% of these design systems have a button component. And if you're ready for my spicy take, do you want my first spicy
Oh,
take?
I'm so ready. So ready. Yes.
I don't think buttons should be in a design system. Or actually, I don't think they should be components. I think they should just be CSS classes and a HTML element. That's my hot take. I don't think they
Okay.
need the whole component. That's my hot take. You can fight me on Twitter. Um, but you go down, and so there's like checkbox, tooltip, tabs is like the fourth most common
Yeah. Lots of people
control.
reinventing, or I guess inventing for the first time, tabs over and over again.
Yes, and the spoiler is we are doing it poorly every time. I I was probably developing like 10 years before I realized like, oh, I did it very wrong. And so I think like we find out about accessibility kind of way too late in the game,
Hmm.
too often. And you think like, oh, I'm just going to spin up some tabs, show, hide, boom, bada bing, bada boom, I'm done. It is not that easy. There's like a lot of ARIA selected, ARIA, uh, what is it? ARIA labeled by and stuff like that to kind of make it all gel together. And you have to manage all that. And there's some states and inverse states like ARIA selected and stuff like that. It's not that easy. And uh, we end up in a situation where, like on what is it, WebAIM's million study,
Hmm.
where like 97% of websites are inaccessible. Just
Yes.
that's where we end up. So because we're always rolling our own tabs, we're rolling our own custom select boxes, we're rolling our own drop downs, our own popovers or pop-ups or drop downs. And so that's one thing that's kind of not reflected in this chart is some things are the same thing and they just have different names, like alert and toast, for example. Like you might call an alert a toast, or you might call it an alert bar, or I don't know, a notification or notice machine or something. So there's like a lot of variance here. It hasn't really, we haven't like done the great merging of this table. I'd be curious to see what it looks like if you like just merged it all down, like Jumbotron. There's another good example, Jumbotron.
Where's the Jumbotron? Gotta see that one. There we
um,
go. Yes.
Popularized by Bootstrap and picked up by I guess Auth0.
Good for you,
Jumbotrons.
Auth0.
um, so another spicy take. Jumbotrons and hero units should also not be in your design system. Oh, they should be really custom and bespoke, is what I
I
think. So
Yeah, I do feel like maybe some of the trickiness here is like whether the design system is intended for internal use or general purpose use. It looks like all the design systems you've got up here are general purpose use, but if you're building a design system for one product or one company, then like maybe it does make sense to put a hero in here. But
yeah, potentially. I just, there's some of them are kind of specific, like Lion and Lightning are kind of like I guess customer spectrum is Adobe. But I don't know, it's all just interesting food for thought. Like there's a lot of elements, but I think the idea here, like Jumbotron's another great example. I don't think we're going to get a Jumbotron in HTML.
mhm.
I'm sorry. sorry, Bootstrap.
We arguably
There's
already have one, right? Like that would be a good use case for the header element in most cases.
Perfect. Yeah, like header of your page, like could just be that. Uh, it's we you don't want to add too many elements, or that's more just an assembly of HTML sort of. There's maybe nothing unique about it. So if we were to research Jumbotron, the likely conclusion might be we don't need to graduate this to HTML. And it's important to distinguish here, like OpenUI is a community group. We can't actually propose HTML. That's not our job.
Okay.
That is by, and there's a lot of reasons, but like one is like copyright. um, but like
Oh, okay.
but like so that is all done by the like W3C, the HTML working group. New CSS, maybe something graduates and it doesn't actually become an element, it just becomes a CSS property. That's going to be through the CSS working group. Or maybe it's another ARIA role or something. We like figured out, oh, we need a ARIA role badge or something. I don't know, I'm just making stuff up.
Sure.
That would be a just we'd have to go to the ARIA working group. And then any HTML that got proposed would have to be vetted by ARIA and CSS and whoever. So that's kind of the situation. Like, I very much see OpenUI as just kind of a big research arm of the W3C, if you will. Just that we are like, I don't know, just ready to really geek out over like what makes tabs or what makes a carousel or what makes a alert, but what do we need to do? What would an HTML version of this really look like? And so we can then propose stuff and upstream stuff. And because people who work on browsers are also involved in this, and CSS spec authors and accessibility experts, ARIA working group people, we can kind of get like an early sentiment of how possible this would be. So,
Yeah.
and yeah.
Okay. Well, cool. So, OpenUI has been hard at work for a while. We were talking ahead of time, and it sounds like OpenUI was chartered around 2019, 2020.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like we're really starting to see some things like land in browsers now, or at least in canary versions of browsers. So what kinds of things are we going to be working with and seeing today from OpenUI?
Yeah, so there is do you want to start on the big one, or do you want let's start on the one I'm working on? Is that fine? Is that
Yeah, I'm good with
okay?
it. Let's do it.
Okay. So one of the big things that I'm sort of semi-serious about is I guess serious enough to volunteer my time, but is HTML needs a tabs element,
Yes.
right? uh, I find this completely 100% non-controversial. um, I Everyone's doing it bad, and so we need some sort of interface that allows us to do it. You have really great framework specific solutions like view tabs, or I think Austin Gill is here. He does view tensils. Is that right, Austin? But like, and then you have like some React tabs and stuff like that. But I think HTML itself really needs its own tab solution. I think that would be very critical to its success. I mean, every major operating system has a tabs, so why not the
Yeah.
web? So.
And I put a link to a stream I had with Chance Strickland, who was on the Reach UI team. We
Mhm.
kind of walked through building a tab, and it's like there's a lot you have to wire together in a way that it's easier to do as a one-off and much harder to do as any sort of reusable component.
Right, right. Like it's hard to think of all the situations somebody might want to use tabs, and then what we've kind of discovered as we've started researching it and looking into it, and this is a group of people I'm affiliated with, the Tab Vengers, which is like Brian Cardell, Miriam, Mia, Suzanne, Jonathan Neal, Hida DeVries, me, and then some other people, Scott O'Hara, Leonie Watson, Pascal Schilp, a lot of other people are kind of in this. We call ourselves the Tab Vengers. Hey, Brian's in the chat. But we are basically like trying to figure out how this would work. And so we came up with this proposal called spicy sections, right? Notice it's not called tabs. That's kind of an important thing, because if we're like, where we did tabs, everyone would be very like, people would show up being with a bunch of opinions. So it's spicy sections, because I think what we realized when we started researching tabs was tabs are kind of just a visual metaphor, right? Like a of like file folders. I mean, I have like whatever, I have literal like tax documents. I brought props. I have a file folder, a tab right here. They're a visual metaphor, and affordance is kind of what Brian Cardell called it, and I think we all have all gravitated around. They're a visual affordance, but in addition to visual affordances, and you have aural, like audio affordances. So how it announces is different than how it presents, or completely decoupled, you might say. The way it announces and the way it looks is totally different, although they are like aligned, but it's just a different paradigm, maybe.
Yeah, like I'm even thinking about like, what would I expect the screen reader experience for something like tabs or spicy sections to be? Because usually, like, you have a row of tabs, or I guess it could be arranged as a column.
Mhm.
And then you have, after that, you have the content. But I guess in assistive technology, I would be more likely to expect them to be like more co-located or something like that. Like, you would have the tab name followed by the content that the tab describes. Like, and maybe that's not necessarily the case, but the fact that I'm not even entirely certain indicates to me that there's a wide open space of just questions to answer about this experience.
Totally. Yeah. And you kind of like group these into like different tab, like there's ARIA roles for each of these. Uh, just in terms of like how they announce. Role equals tab list. I'm going to mess this up. Role equals tab list is the list of all the tabs. I'm failing. Okay. But and then role equals tab is the actual like tab button that you're clicking. And then tab panel is the panel of content that shows when you click a tab. As you dig into the problem, you realize semantically an accordion that shows one thing at a time is like almost indistinguishable, both in keyboard operation. Those would be another kind of affordance that comes along with the visual affordance or the aural affordance, but a single like paneled accordion, an exclusive collapse accordion, is basically the same experience to a screen reader. It's just showing one panel of content. You presented a list of options and you're showing one panel at a time as you click in. Okay, so you dig into the problem more, but that's not how we do accordions, right? Like we tend to kind of have the exclusive and non-exclusive variants as well. But one problem we also realized is sometimes when you're on like doing a responsive website, and you have tabs, a common pattern, and this is like Brad Frost talked about this in like 2011 or something, like right after Ethan's book came out. Like you flip it to an accordion. You go from, or it's an accordion on mobile, and then it flips into tabs when you have more spaces available. That's like a pretty common UI pattern, because tabs would introduce accessibility problems with like horizontal panning and scrolling if we just let it overflow. So as we dug into this, we realized like these are not, like tabs is probably the wrong word. These are kind of just like sections of content that we are manipulating. And the sort of key thing there is we then looked at like the different markup patterns for a like tab control. And sometimes you have, the tab group on the outside, or tabs element, or whatever you want, component. And then you have tab 1, tab 2, tab 3, and then panel 1, panel 2, panel 3. That's okay. But if the JavaScript failed or whatever, and the screen or an old browser came to this, if it was like an HTML or it doesn't have web components or whatever, and the screen reader read it, it would just hear tab 1, tab 2, tab 3, panel 1, panel 2, panel 3. And like, it doesn't make sense. Like there's no semantic
Yeah.
sort of like meaning there. So we kind of built this off the idea that we could do like heading content, sort of that pattern. And so it would read as like H2 ingredients, a list of ingredients, H2 instructions, a list of instructions. So it'd be like tab 1, panel 1, tab 2, panel 2. That's if the thing failed. But one cool thing about our sort of solution here is like the sections of content, these are just visual affordance. An accordion is a visual affordance. A tabs is a visual affordance. You may not even want either of those. You may just want like an accordion on mobile and a regular column of content on desktop. We offer that. You can just go to a regular column of content, just like regular DOM, and that's pretty cool. So we're just changing the affordance, but you preserve the good markup, quote unquote, like the structural semantic markup in there. And then we've kind of like been waffling, like this is inside baseball a bit, but like we've been like thinking about like, maybe you don't want an H and an H tag and a content next to each other. Maybe it's not always heading content. Maybe you're something like, I can't really think of a situation, but like maybe like a sidebar drop down or something like that. Maybe you want something different. So we came up with like the spicy H element that kind of goes along with this. And it's just sort of just a generic heading sort of.
Is there anything
I think it's
in here?
it should be, it's pretty new. So it might not be in the documentation yet. It's not in the documentation yet.
And support for spicy H.
Yes.
Tag yourself, I'm spicy H.
Yeah, I know. There you go. So we have spicy H now, but that's not like a proposal for like it's kind of for testing purposes, just to see like what we're not proposing an H element, although I am big into the H element. So yeah. So I think we need an H element, a generic H element. But spicy take 3, is that spicy take 3?
It could be. I feel like I needed to have, if I had known that there were going to be, a plethora of spicy takes and not like at most like a single spicy take, I would have added like a spicy take counter for the overlays.
Bing, yeah,
yep.
Next time we'll have to do it. So, so anyway, this is, and if you go out to that demonstration link right at the top of the screen there, yeah, that should work. And you put it in CodePen's like little side panel view. That might be the easiest way to squeeze it.
Something like this.
Yeah. Now, so you see it in tabs, and now give it a squeeze. Just give it a gentle squeeze.
Oh, hello. Oh.
So there's like the regular column of content, just your I don't know, blog post, and there's a collapse. And so there's a column, there's collapse, and then these should all work, and they have like keyboard bindings and everything that you need. So so that's kind of cool. And so that's sort of where we're at with this. And really the like, I think our goal, and I'm hopefully not over speaking for the team, but like our goal is ultimately to have something in HTML that works. I think this is big enough, critical enough infrastructure that there needs to be something in HTML, but it does, whatever ends up in HTML needs to kind of be flexible like this.
Yeah.
And so I think it needs to kind of have some of this feature set. And
yeah,
so,
because like if you get something that's like not extremely flexible and you have a tabs element that is close enough but just not quite for anyone, or like for any one person's like purposes, they're just gonna reinvent tabs again, and that kind of defeats a lot of the purpose of having this in there to start with.
Yeah, totally. And there's even like kind of subtly things that kind of, these are like background issues, but like, when you do like a Command F and find on page, what happens? I don't think it's going to show in ours, but if we had like a native thing, you could in theory pop open that. You could pop open that box. You know what I mean? So there's kind of this like interesting thing we could do if it was a native element that would be more accessible, more inclusive than the current roll your own JavaScript thing that we have. So, but yeah, so that's spicy sections. If you want to use it, it's tab vendors /spicy-sections. we would love to get feedback. So if people are using it, styling it, breaking it, loving it, hating it, let us know.
Mhm.
We like really are in the feedback stage, we should say. So
So this repo has a web component that people can start like using today, is what you're saying.
yep, you can
That's
use
super
it
neat.
today. So, and then if you, and there's a bunch of tests that have kind of showed up. Like, I think there's probably some like few little bits we need to do, like housekeeping things, but yeah, there's a whole bunch of stuff. So, yeah.
Nice. Very cool. Okay, and Brian's clarifying, I think, about um uh the control F support that is currently already there for focusable things like anchor links, or at least just anchor links.
Oh,
That makes
okay.
sense.
Oh, there you
Yeah,
go. So
very cool.
we have some.
Okay.
Thanks,
Um
Brian. Appreciate you.
Rob Levin Tennis says, when Dave says native, is that a component that quote extends HTML element? Like,
Well, no, well, right now it does that. So right now it is a web
mhm,
component that extends HTML element, but,
yeah.
and so it's, I guess, native-ish. That's part of the web platform. But I mean, like, no hyphen.
Yeah.
I mean, like, tabs element. And it's probably not, spicy sections is not going to be the final name,
Mhm.
sadly. My other proposal, mighty morphing element, is not going to be the final name. We're kind of in this like these sort of are the three horses in the race right now: panel set, section list, and SL, which would be like section list, but sort of in the DLOL vibe. So you can vote for those. It looks like panel set is decidedly winning. But
Interesting.
just this idea of like these are panels of content.
Mhm.
And so these aren't final, but these are kind of like, if we are going to graduate this into a more official open UI thing, we thought it might probably needs a more efficient name. So, but who knows what it's going to end up with in the browser. HTML working group may just say like, no, it has to be called Dave Rupert. And I would say, well, guys, surely there's a more semantic name, but they say, no, it has to be called Rupert. It has to be called that. And I would just have to agree, So,
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm looking forward to the eventual Rupert element. I will talk about this on this show, my blog. I'll blog about Rupert.
yeah,
Um,
I just, the web platform needs it. And, it's either
mhm.
that or, I don't know. My life goal is two life goals are get an HTML element named after me. Probably not going to happen. Second life goal, get a breakfast plate named after me. I think
that
that's even
that one
a
seems
step up.
that one seems practical. You just have to infiltrate your local diner and just become very good friends. The first one, your first life goal, I might have to ask you to pick a different life goal. Or
All right. All right.
you
Yeah.
you could always change your last name to be like DL, and then there is an element with your last name.
That's
Like,
a good, that's a good point. See, I thought you were crushing my dreams on the show, but
no,
you saved it.
I'm
You
just
saved it.
providing more pragmatic alternatives to reach your goal.
Pragmatic. That's good. Perfect.
All right. Um, yeah, so that is very cool. I am curious actually, on the scale of kind of the research that OpenUI operates at, like what are the kind of the time scales we've been looking at? Like how long have spicy sections been kind of in the works by the team? And how much longer do you think it'll take before this gets proposed to the relevant working groups?
That's a good question. So we've started probably end of 2020, I think is what
Okay.
I want to say. And then through 2021, just kind of worked on it. And um, I don't know. You know, the thing is, interactive elements don't come out that often.
Hmm.
we got button at
Yeah.
the beginning, and the last two that are kind of semi-interactive or are like dialogue and details,
Hmm.
which I think were possibly 2011 creations, and that we're just finally getting dialogue and it's still a little broke, but we're fixing it. So I think interactive elements don't come along that time, and even elements take a long time to percolate through the HTML system.
Yeah.
But uh, I think this way of doing it through OpenUI and vetting things with web components, I think it's a much better path than we've ever had before. If that makes
Mhm.
sense, we are able to see what it looks like. We're able to get developer feedback. We're able to kind of uh, propose big solutions, small solutions, get a group of experts. It doesn't have to. Hopefully, we head off a lot of discussion, like big problems, like this is completely inaccessible. Like, hopefully, we head that off earlier in the process than later in the process, which is unfortunately what happened with like dialogue and stuff like that. So.
Mm, gotcha. Um, yeah. Is there more you wanted to add about spicy sections?
No, I think that's it. I mean, again, just if anyone wants to use it, we'd love the feedback. So try to,
Best place to leave that, would that be the issues, or is
yep,
there a better
yep.
place?
Issues
Okay,
right there works just for great for us. So,
good. All right.
and yeah,
Go ahead, Dave.
well, okay, we got some more stuff. So
Cool.
open UI, not done releasing bangers yet. So um, so there's two kind of big ones left, and they're sort of connected in some way, but they are pop-up and select menu.
Okay.
So let's go. Is there a pop-up? Yeah, enabling pop-up.
This is
That's
okay. You gave me so many links to start out with, and
sorry.
they're all gold mines. It's just having to find the right gold mine.
Yeah. Well, and it's there's a lot of links, a lot of content to dig through, and so it helps to have a Sherpa, a guide through it all.
Mhm.
So this was an Edge explainer, Microsoft Edge. I think Melanie Richards was one of the initial authors on it. Um, uh, this pop-up was this idea of this element that exists on the top layer and is anchorable to another element. Does that make sense? So
What do you
it's
mean
sort
by
of like
anchorable in this case?
like in the popper JS sense, or so
Mm,
you can say like go to the middle bottom or go to the bottom right or 10 pixels offset or something like that. So
mhm.
this was the initial explainer.
Gotcha.
And you can kind of read through some of the use cases to get a pop-up kind of going. And again, it sits on the top layer. It doesn't sit on the like, it can't be z-indexed over, and that's kind of an important thing, especially with like pop-ups. And you know, there, you sort of start seeing the problems right away as from an accessibility kind of perspective. Pop-up is a big word.
Yeah.
Adrian Roselli has a great post on this. That pop-up can mean drop down, can mean pop over, can mean a context menu. It can be, yeah, stop using pop-up. Just this is just a good post on like, here's what drop down and pop up, here's what they mean. This it's just such I don't know, it's a hard word to describe, but when you go
Mhm.
to like accessibility semantics, you kind of mean like, is it a pop-up? That's an actual accessibility term. Is it a tooltip? Is it a list box? Is it a combo box? Is it, there's different sort of verbiage in HTML or in ARIA, I guess, that sort of you mean something else when you mean pop-up,
Mhm.
context menus, stuff like that. And so, and that was like a alert, or toast was another good one. Like that's a totally different sort of thing from a what does a pop-up sort of mean? But Mason Fried and I think maybe Rob Flack is also involved, and then Una is also involved on the like anchoring side of things, the CSS sort of things, because that's probably going to be its own whole thing. Like, how do you anchor an element to another element, just
Mhm.
like by some kind of keyword thing? So a lot of JavaScript goes into doing that, and we could maybe solve it in the browser. That would be nice. But this is evolving, and I think the final idea is maybe this is not an element. So some open UI things graduate to web components, some graduate to elements, and some don't. And so what we're maybe thinking now, the current thinking is kind of like this might just be a display pop-up. And maybe we have a list box element that displays pop-up. And so, or it could change, you could just have a list box display block or something like that on a phone or something. So it's interesting to think about. And this is like way above my pay grade, but it's all very interesting problems when you're trying to propose like a top layer element. Like, how does it behave? How does it announce? How does it interact? All that stuff. But in the same vein, and kind of building off of this, if you go back to that like Greg Whitworth post, one of the things, where
Put
was
that
it?
one. Did I put that one? Here it is.
Initial thoughts. Yeah. So one of the things people are doing is building select boxes over and over and over. And I think
Yeah.
the reason they're doing that is so that they can style them.
Yeah, that
One
makes
would one
sense.
would think. I mean, you don't just like, I'm just gonna give myself a hard time. You do it for a reason, and that's usually to style it. So some people, this is like Dan Clark and Patrick Brossett over at an Edge team, and I think Mason and Rob are helping out. They have a select menu element in the
Okay.
works, and it's in your Chrome Canary or Edge Canary right now. So if you
Yes.
go, yeah, here you go. If you go to Chrome Canary and then you go to the About Flags, and I think you have or yeah, you can just pull that up.
Yeah. I'll just pull it up again. I think we've already. Yeah. There we go.
Yeah, and then you go to like experimental web platform features and you enable that. I like to do that in my Chrome Canary version just because like that's where all the latest and greatest and browser crashing stuff sits. So you can just I wouldn't do Canary for my day-to-day browser, but that's something that you could I don't know, play around with. So um and then there's I think I sent a link over for the select menu. Patrick Brossett recently did a demo on the select menu and kind of like all the oh yeah, here you go. There's a great, yeah, he just wrote an article. Say hello to Selectmenus.
Yes.
So they've been working on this, and basically they have a prototype in the browser of a completely stylable select menu. And this is it. It's kind of wild. Like if you look at this first one, like just click this guy's face.
I love that.
Whoa,
I love that.
that does not look like a regular select. It looks a little bit different, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if you like right click it and inspect it, you can kind of, this is kind of where it gets a little weird, possibly. Um, but so there's select menu, right? And
Mm-hmm.
class bubble. And then it has a slot, which is kind of a web component idea, but it's brought over here to like show what the button looks like, right? And then there's pop-up, right? So this is where we're kind of like mixing our metaphors here, but like pop-up probably won't be pop-up in the final thing. But you can just chuck HTML in your select menu. And then you start to see like, and then if you keep opening, it might show you some options. And I think each one of those
Oh.
smileys is an option value. So those are each option elements inside a select. So it's pretty cool. I think there's currently some issues open about accessibility, so I want to get that out in the open. But this is just kind of a very interesting solution. We're using the old-fashioned option value that we are all used to, and then you wrap it in a select, and you get a pretty familiar. You wrap it in select menu, sorry, and you get a pretty familiar, I don't know, programming interface.
Yeah.
That the old HTML you're used to, but a little more customized.
It's not hard to imagine like writing some scripts to like add more options in here and stuff like that. This is yeah, like it's just as flexible as any other DOM element, which is
Yeah,
I dig.
and like it's like you can go down through all these demos here. And like this second one was, yeah, you have to scroll or else it'll stick to the ceiling, but like a select menu that opens up in the middle, like
Yeah.
a, like that's kind of actually hard to do. And then even just the way the selected option presents, um, this one has a search thing in there. You can just like find yep,
Ooh. Ooh.
like that's a pretty handy thing. These aren't like all built-in native. I think that we're extending this idea, but like multiple selects, because you control the way the button presents. That's pretty cool. This account switcher is probably like my favorite, like the most basic. Like there you go, that's what people want in their UI.
Mm-hmm.
um GitHub issue filters on another classic, like where you have like a row of options and then like a row of emoji below it.
Yeah.
And then that dribbles filter is probably the best one, just like the most basic one, because you can add in like colors,
Okay.
style things, add images,
Oh.
hello,
Oh.
inside your
Ooh.
selects, and they're pretty great. um the, right now I think it all works with like keyboard stuff. I think there's a few bit of like um issues with like selecting the right thing, but like if you like typed or something like that, I don't know if it like actually hits the right, like if you type like brave, would it go to brave right now? I don't think it would. So like stuff like
Yeah.
that the native select or the original select does. But yeah, select menu, it's kind of a new frontier for like, and if you look at the HTML, that it should just be like select menu and things.
I totally expect to see like image tags in here or something.
No,
Uh,
no options. And you don't even need that pop-up thing. I think he's just shoving that into the element. So you can just do it with like move those. Yeah, you could just move those up and stuff like that. So it's very cool. I'm very like stoked on this future. It's in Canary. It's experimental, I should say. Like it's not coming out anytime soon,
mhm.
but it's here. We can play with it. We can give feedback on it. We can evaluate it, and then we can see if it's something that should go forward. And I think both Microsoft and Chrome are very eager to get these problems solved for us. So
Very cool. Yeah, that is super exciting. Um, Jonathan in the chat says, "I like it. I wonder if some of those attributes, like the behavior, would be better expressed in CSS. They might need to be different in different conditions."
yeah, um, yeah, and that's kind of a good question. And one we've been thinking about,
Yeah.
and one we've been thinking. Um, it very much is like, how do you communicate behavior? And there's an old post by Tab Atkins about attribute style sheets, which has an unfortunate acronym. But wait, cascading attribute sheets, maybe attribute style sheets. That's a much better
Oh yeah.
than attribute style sheets. Um, uh, yeah, that's it. Tab Atkins, wonderful person. In the same way you do CSS, there's this idea of like, maybe you could just, instead of like, you could program attributes in a CSS like language.
Mhm.
Um, and to was it Jonathan's point? Like maybe we could program behavior here, or maybe it's in CSS. But this would be very interesting to think about, like an interesting future. Even
Yeah.
just like getting your ARIA attributes out of the DOM and into
Yeah.
here
I've,
would be
I've
beautiful.
I've
So,
been thinking of this ever since I had an issue that I was working on at work where when you have like for instance a code block that is its own independently scrollable region. It's usually helpful to add like a tab index because since
Yeah.
it's scrollable, it needs to be keyboard navigable, and so you add a tab index. But you don't want to just add a tab index to all code blocks because then you're just going to get a whole bunch of noise in your keyboard navigation. So it's like it would ideally be best if you could add the tab index when the code block is going to overflow, right? And that's the kind of thing
Hmm.
that like feels like it would be much nicer to do in kind of CSS's declarative way, even maybe with CSS's like media queries and whatnot.
Totally. Because and back to the kind of the like affordance thing, like you may want a different presentation, like you may say like, okay, we're going to cap the height on desktop, or but on mobile we're just going to let it scroll infinitely, because scroll inside like the glassy scroll of a mobile device is kind of bad. So like we kind of want on a media query, we want to trigger this tab index, right? So
Mhm.
there's so many kind of um I don't know, like it just makes sense, I guess, is what I want to say. Like
Mhm.
let me just have this, because I'm dealing with a problem on my site. I wrote some blog post titles in a different language, and um guess what, it's very bad on screen reader, and I use like Edge's read aloud feature all the time.
Mhm.
So I'm hearing it very badly because it's like capital Greek T, capital Greek A, or it's just like,
Ah,
and
yes,
so
okay.
I just was like, shoot, this is not good. And my problem now is I have to go roll out a whole bunch of infrastructure to add language attributes to titles or something, when it would be cooler, hear me out,
Mhm.
if I just had I don't know, an attributes tag, and I could just like hot fix those attributes, rather than like
Yes.
adding infrastructure to my application or my blog, my Jekyll blog, just to support a title in a different language. So yeah, it's all something to think about. But so like, I don't know, I'm bullish on like we need something like this, but like if maybe we could get some behaviors in here or something, or
Mhm.
something like this or something, uh, but I don't know, but it's interesting. And so like this, a lot of open UI is talking about stuff, arguing about what should happen with focus states, and then moving on, trying to get to a conclusion or resolution. Um,
You've been in my accessibility office hours then, because that's exactly what that is.
oh,
Um,
it's I think it's 90% arguing about focus. I like, because there's the one thing that's coming up in OpenUI is there's like an idea of like autofocus. Obviously, we have autofocus, but when you open an accordion or a tab or a pop up or a dialogue, right? You
mhm.
want focus, autofocus, the first focusable, or like heading or input, or what the first focusable thing, relevant focusable thing, because H1s aren't always focusable or whatever.
Mhm.
How do you do that? So maybe we have like a delegates focus thing. I think that's actually a web component thing, so we can't use that. Um, but like, how do we like programmatically or declaratively set focus on something? And then there's also this other idea of like light dismiss. So like hitting escape to like close something, or clicking out of it to close something. What gets light dismiss behavior and what doesn't? We spent hours discussing that, and I'm afraid I still don't know the answer, but that's that is something you have to think about when talking about elements. But what's cool is this stuff is being talked about, and people are working on this, and it's a pretty open group. There's a meeting every like Thursday or so, if an agenda makes. This guy Andrico hopped in, said I want help, and started working on toast, like an alert pattern of some kind. That one's a little tricky. It's a lot to think through, because like not every alerts an actual aria role equals alert. So
Mhm.
like, oh man, what do we do? How do we get out of this jam? So
Yeah, like
uh,
toasts are complicated also because like a lot of design systems have like interactive buttons and stuff like that. And if you're just relying on roll equals alert, then people aren't going to be able to get to that button. So yeah,
right. And so like if you just announce like, hey, everything's broken, like how do you shift tab and try to get to it, or what, what do you do to like go click the like click this link to find out what's broken link or whatever, or close it, from my screen.
hmm
That stuff's hard. That stuff's really
yeah,
hard to figure out. So,
very
and
cool.
there's it's tough too because we all have different modalities or whatever, and so like it's easy for me, the sighted person, to just be like, oh, I'll just click that button and say goodbye, but it's not always that easy for everybody, and so
hmm
it's we whatever we put in the web has to be good. So we gotta
Absolutely.
figure that out. So
So, one last question I guess I want to ask is how could someone get involved in OpenUI? What's the best way to get involved in this process?
so there is a Discord, and there should be a link at the top of the OpenUI site. Discord, I think, is down right now, so
Yeah.
good luck. But there's a Discord there, and so pretty friendly. Just stop in, say hi, introduce yourself, what you do. Then there's a meeting every week. Usually they post like an agenda beforehand, but it's Thursdays at we're both in Texas, right? So
hmm
1:30 Texas time. So then we all you can hop on there and talk about focus and and, but also like if you're uh, I think one thing we're trying to figure out right now is trying to figure out ways that people can drop in. I think of it like a half pipe, like you're waiting for your turn to drop in on something, like I'm okay, now I'm gonna go.
hmm
So I think we're trying to figure out ways to make it where like you could see active projects, what needs to be worked on, where there's interest. um, but if you get in and you say I'm really passionate about breadcrumbs, guess what, you get the breadcrumbs issue. So I think people have kind of, some of this has research, so you may I hate it when people are like, you got to read the whole manual before you can participate, but it may be worth it if you're like, I want to work on something, kind of read the existing stuff and try to figure out where it is. But chances, I think most of this stuff that's in here has not been fully like we haven't fully diagnosed everything about it. So I think it's worth getting in, and if you know how to make a web component, that helps too. We can make prototypes of potential elements, and that's a big deal. So yeah.
Good deal. Dave, thank you so much for your time. It has been delightful having you, delightful learning about some of these things that are coming in the research that's being done. So thank you so much for coming on. Y'all, if you're not already following Dave, first of all, how? Second of all, dare you? Um, and go follow Dave on Twitter. He's at Davidtron or Davitron. How do you pronounce that actually?
Davidtron, yeah.
Davidtron.
And
All
there's
right.
DAVA. There's a DAVE Tron 5000 as well. He's a very talented Rubyist, but he does not like it when we get mixed up. So
Okay. Um, and go listen to Shop Talk as well. That's some
yeah.
good listenings. Y'all have YouTubes as well. Go check those out. Um, and y'all, it's been delightful having you. Join us next week. For I'm bringing Amit Sheen on. Amit is a CSS wizard. He does all sorts of wild stuff with like 3D CSS animations. He's going to be talking about what almost feels kind of like the flip side of this in a way, but it's JavaScript problems with CSS solutions. So how to start like approaching problem solving from a CSS perspective rather than a JavaScript perspective. I guess one other thing I wanted to promote. I have merch. Go get merch. I'll
Hey.
put a link to that in the chat as well. There's an offer code for the next few days. Go get merch. They're good shirts, HTML themed, logo themed, stuff like that. Good stuff. But y'all, it's been delightful having y'all here. Thank you to everyone who showed up, especially those who showed up from OpenUI. Y'all's chat was fantastic, and like I was reading through that while listening to Dave. I'm like, no, like the OpenUI folks have it. I'll tune out Dave for a bit. um,
They're a lot smarter. So I occupy the role of podcast pundit in the
hmm.
open UI space.
Yeah, if you are interested in more weekly shows about accessibility and core web technologies, while you're following Dave, you should also follow some Antics here on Twitch at SemanticSev and on Twitter at SemanticSev. Um, and stick around, we're gonna find someone to raid. Have a good one, y'all.